From 10,000 feet above Europe, Allied and Axis bombers crisscrossed the sky, armed with cameras as deadly as their bombs. Yet right beneath them, some shelters stayed invisible. Not damaged, not missed, simply never seen. That wasn't luck, it was design. During World War II, survival often came down to one brutal reality. If the enemy could spot you from the air, you were already in danger. Cities burned, factories vanished, and entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble because aerial reconnaissance gave bombers a clear map of what to destroy. So engineers, farmers, civilians, and military planners had to outthink the sky itself. What they built was one of the most quietly brilliant survival solutions of the 20th century. Shelters that blended so completely into the landscape that pilots flew straight over them without a second glance. This is the story of how they did it, why it worked, and what it still teaches us about survival today. The air war changed everything. Before World War II, most wars were fought face-to-face. Trenches, artillery and troop movements defined the battlefield. World War II flipped that logic upside down. Aircraft turned cities into targets and civilians into frontline casualties. Reconnaissance planes photographed roads, rail lines, buildings, even shadows. Those photos guided bombing raids with ruthless efficiency. Anything that broke the pattern stood out. Straight lines, fresh soil, sharp edges, unnatural shapes. Pilots were trained to spot these details instantly. A bunker wasn't just a shelter. From the air, it was a liability, unless it could disappear. That forced a radical rethink. Protection alone wasn't enough. Concealment became survival. One of the most effective World War II shelters wasn't hidden under concrete or steel domes. It was, well, hidden in plain sight. Across Britain and parts of occupied Europe, underground shelters were designed to mimic the land above them. They followed the natural contours of the terrain instead of cutting against it. Their roofs weren't flat slabs. They were gently sloped, irregular, and layered with earth, turf or gravel taken directly from the surrounding area. Grass wasn't planted neatly. It was allowed to grow wild. Moss was encouraged. Weeds were left alone. From above, these shelters didn't look engineered. They looked accidental. And that was the point. Aerial photography relies on contrast. These shelters offered none. Camouflage wasn't paint. It was behavior. Here's the clever part most people miss. Camouflage wasn't just about what the shelter looked like. It was about how people behaved around it. Paths were never worn directly to the entrance. Foot traffic was scattered deliberately to avoid forming visible tracks. Any displaced soil was spread thin over wide areas or, carried far away. Smoke from cooking fires was vented through long, narrow channels to cool and disperse before it reached the surface. Even doors mattered. Entrances were offset, hidden under sheds, haystacks, garden plots, or small outbuildings that already belonged in the landscape. Some were disguised as root cellars or animal pens. Others were placed inside existing homes, so, no new structure appeared at all. From the air, nothing changed. And if nothing changed, nothing was targeted. Much of this knowledge didn't come from military textbooks. It came from farmers, foresters, and rural builders. Farmers understood, how land naturally erodes, grows, and settles. They knew that straight lines were, quite rare in nature, that freshly turned earth always catches the eye, and that water, it flows in predictable ways and leaves visible scars if disrupted. Shelter builders, they copied these patterns. Drainage followed natural slopes. Rooflines, mimicked hills. Even seasonal colour changes were considered, so a green patch wouldn't suddenly turn brown, while everything else stayed alive. This wasn't high-tech, not at all. It was observational intelligence, and honestly, it worked. During World War II, bombers didn't have, satellite imagery or live feeds. Crews had to rely on pre-flight photos, visual confirmation, and, pattern recognition. Their task was to spot whatever didn't belong. These shelters, they belonged. They didn't cast any suspicious shadows. They didn't interrupt the crop rows. And they didn't create hard edges where none should exist. Even when bombers flew low, there was, honestly, nothing to lock onto. In some documented areas, entire underground networks survived, even as nearby factories and rail yards were, completely flattened. Not because they were stronger, but simply because they were forgettable. In war, being forgettable can save your life. There's another layer to this story that often gets overlooked. People living with constant air raid threats needed more than just physical safety. They needed calm. A shelter that felt integrated into daily life helped maintain routine and morale. Going into a bunker that felt like a natural extension of your home or land was far less terrifying than running toward a stark concrete box that screamed danger. These shelters didn't feel temporary. They felt grounded, stable, permanent. That psychological comfort mattered, especially during long bombing campaigns when, stress alone could break people. What makes these shelters so impressive isn't mystery or secrecy, it's restraint. Builders, really resisted the urge to overbuild. They used local materials, since those materials already matched the environment so well. They avoided symmetry and they planned for time, knowing that weather would soften edges and, growth would eventually complete the disguise. Even today, some of these shelters remain undiscovered, unless you know exactly where to look. That's not an accident. That's good survival design. So, what does all of this teach us today? Modern survival thinking often jumps straight to technology. Sensors, cameras, reinforced structures. But, World War II's invisible shelters remind us of something a bit older and, honestly, more reliable. The best protection is, quite often, simply not being noticed at all. Blending in, it beats standing out. Understanding your environment, that always beats fighting it. And really, using what's already there is better than importing solutions that just draw attention. Whether it's shelter placement, off-grid living, or emergency planning, the same principle applies. If your setup disrupts natural patterns, it announces itself. But if it flows with them, it just disappears. That's not just wartime wisdom. That's timeless survival thinking. These shelters didn't win medals. They weren't paraded through victory celebrations. Most people never knew they existed. But they did their job. They kept families alive. They preserved critical operations. They proved that intelligence doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers and waits while danger passes overhead. And in a war defined by noise, fire and destruction, that quiet success mattered more than anyone realized. If stories like this fascinate you, if you appreciate the forgotten skills that kept people alive long before modern technology took over, you're in the right place. Subscribe to Legacy of Survival. Like the video if this story surprised you, and share it with someone who appreciates real-world ingenuity. History still has a lot to teach us, and we're just getting started.